All right, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about weavings, and weaving is when I'm taking and making fabric. Now, I can use old fabric. If I want to make my new fabric, I can use yarn, so I can use fabric. I can use yarn. I can use found materials. I might even use, again, ribbons or different things like that. You can find your own ideas. This is a great way to use your stretch and explore just trying different things. And also, again, envision some different ideas of what you might want to make. Now, again, with weavings, you can do some kind of fun things where you can do stuff like you can make a little pouch out of your fabric that you create, or you might decide that you want to make a wall hanging that will hang up. You could even weave enough fabric, then sew them together and turn them into a blanket or something. Now, to get started, I'm going to show you how to set up a loom, and I'm going to show you the tools that you're going to need. So we already know that, again, we can use any of these tools here to make our fabric, but today I'm going to use yarn. Now, there's the box of yarn in my classroom, and when you're using that box of yarn, make sure that you're always leaving a long tail sticking out from the box. Otherwise, you're going to end up leaving it so that no one else gets to use that color until I go back and fix it. Okay? So again, always leave long tails. Long tails. Okay? I'm also going to need a needle. Now these are special weaving needles. You'll notice they have a huge eye on this end. That eye is going to make it really easy for me to put stuff like, again, yarn into there. It's also going to make it really easy for me to put something like a strip of fabric that I've cut, or maybe a piece of ribbon, or whatever tool I want to use. And it's got a nice big eye. And you'll notice they're really long. My normal needles, even the yarn needles, are only going to be about that long. These nice long ones are great for weaving with. So I've got my weaving needle here, and then I'm going to need a loom. Now, some looms, or most of the looms that I have in my room are these cardboard looms. I can make my own loom if I want. I do have some different size. You can see I can make, or I have one that's really nice and wide here. And then I also have these really nice narrow ones. This narrow one was what I used to make this. Okay, so just an idea. I can use a wider one and make a much bigger piece of fabric from it. Okay, now when I get started, I'm going to have to start by setting up my warp. I'm sorry. Now the warp are going to be those threads on a loom that are running up and down. Now these are going to be the ones that we weave into as I'm weaving in my picture here. So again, the warp is going to be the up and down ones, like I said. These that are running side to side are going to be my weft. And that weft is what I'm going to be able to see the most of. So again, this that I see, this color, is the weft. The warp was just what was going in between those wefts. So when you're choosing colors, the warp doesn't matter what color I choose. Okay? That's a really bad picture there. I'm going to go with warp, pointing down like that. The weft is what I really want to be concerned with when I'm choosing my colors. I can make them both the same, and then I don't have to worry about it. Now some yarns, like you'll notice this one's it's called a variegated yarn, and the reason it's variegated is it's got different colors in there. So sometimes I like to use those when I'm making my weaving so that I can get some different colors without having to change the colors so often. Now, to make my weaving get started, I'm going to need to start with a slip knot. Now for a slip knot, I take 2 fingers, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take my end of my yarn, and I'm going to wrap it around my fingers and crisscross it. You see my crisscross there? Now, to make this into a slip knot, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that loop. That I'm going to take out my fingers here, and I can see that it's made that X. I'm going to stick my finger inside. I'm going to pinch that up, and normally if I were making a slip knot, I just go ahead and pull that little loop through, not the whole end, but the little loop, and I pull it tight. Now, the reason it's called a slip knot is because I can make my loop bigger, or if I pull in my end, I can make my loop smaller so I can get it tighter. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you that one more time. Take my 2 fingers, take my end and I'm going to wrap it around and crisscross. I like to leave a nice long tail, and I can grab that end bit. If I pull on that loop, I can pull it tight. Now that I've got it tight, I've got this loop that I can make smaller or that I can make bigger. Okay. Now, I can put that loop around my end here, and I'm going to pull it tight as I can. Okay. Now, to set up my warp, the easiest way in my class is to do it by wrapping it around my loom. I'm going to see if I can zoom this out more, or maybe I'll just have to show you a little bit at a time. So I'm going to pull my string all the way across and go to the opposite side. I'm going to loop it down. Then I'm going to flip this over. See how there's none here? And I'm going to go across all the way to the second notch. I flip it over again, and there I'm on my second notch, and I can pull it all the way down again and go to the other side here, and I'm going to keep doing that. Now I'm going to do it just a little bit faster without flip-flopping it, but if you need to flip-flop yours, you go right ahead. But I'm going to do this until I get it as wide as I want. Now, if I want it to be as wide as my whole board, I would keep going. If I want it to only be a little bit wide, I might stop a little early. Either way is fine. Okay. Now, I'm going to keep wrapping. I'm not going to go all the way because I want to get started on my weaving for you. This I can do by just pulling the yarn right out of the box. And then I'm going to cut off what I use anyways, so don't worry. If you bring your own ball of yarn, or if you ask me for a ball of yarn, I can give you a smaller one, and you can do this at your table spot. Now, I'm almost done. There's my last one. I guess I could get this done. It didn't take too long. Now I've come down to the very last notch. At this point, I need to make a new knot. So I'm going to take my pair of scissors here, and with my scissors, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to cut off a chunk. Now, do you see how long a tail I'm leaving? Long ends are good. Now, with my long end here, I'm going to need to make a new slip knot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, again, use my 2 fingers, my end here. I'm going to wrap around until I've got that X. I'm going to go ahead and reach my finger in. I'm going to grab my loop and I'm going to tighten it. Now, the trick is I want to tighten it so that it's going to be really good and tight for the next part. So I'm going to really give it a good tug to make sure it's nice and tight. Now you'll see I have one side that's all strung. I've got 1 string in each notch. And when I flip it over, I can see now I have a diagonal line. That's just fine. That's what I want it to look like. This side we're not going to weave into. The other side is what we're going to use for weaving. So now that I've got my loom set up, I've got my warp on there, I need to get some yarn for my weft. So with my yarn, I'm going to pull off a big, long piece. I usually like to make mine fingertip to fingertip, so I pull it all the way across my body, and then I do that twice. That's about how much I need. I have a little bit less than that. It's okay. So I've got my yarn. Now with one of my ends, I like to make a loop to put my on my needle so it doesn't come off as easy. So I fold this in half. I take my loop. I'm just going to push it through my needle. And then, whoopsies, I didn't make it long enough. That's something we learn. Okay, so I take and I push that through, and I'm going to pull my loop out a bit, and I'm going to wrap it around my needle and let it come down. You see how now it's stuck on my needle? That's not going to come off. If I feel like I've got too much length there, I can go ahead and loosen up my loop now, and I can pull that tail so it gets shorter. Really as short as I want it to be. Whoopsies. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull on my other string to tighten up. Okay, until I've got it to the length I want. Now, I've got my needle set up to go. It's not going to come off there, which is really nice until I want it to. And then I've got my other end. Now my other end is going to get tied on to my warp. I like to just use that string that's already there because it's much easier to make a square knot than it is to try to make a knot around. Okay. Otherwise, I could make a slip knot or I could make a loop. It's up to you, but I like doing it this way. So I make an X with my yarns. I take my yarn that's on top and I wrap it around the bottom. Then I take those two ends again. I make an X with my yarn. I take the one that's on top and wrap it around. Now I've got two wraps right next to each other. And I just go ahead and I pull those tight. Okay? I've made a knot to get started and I'm ready to go. Now the big thing is when I'm working on these is I'm going to be always going under, over, under, over. That's the big part of weaving. I can get different designs if I do different under, over combinations, but when you're just getting started, always just start with under, over. So my yarn is on top to start, so I'm going to say this one's going to be my over first. I'm going to go under the second with my needle, over the third, under the second, over the third, or the next, I should say, not third. This is 1, 2, or 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm on to 6, 7, 8, 9, and I keep going. I'm going to run into a problem, you notice. Sometimes I pull my strings up too. That sometimes helps me. But I've run out of room. My needle isn't long enough to go all the way from end to end without pulling once. So I'm going to have to pull this. And every time I pull, I want to pull all the way until my yarn is tight. Otherwise, I end up getting weird loops and knots and things like that. These tails, I don't want them woven in, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get this all set. And I push them up. I leave those tails loose there. Now I'm not pulling so tight that it yanks my yarn over on the ends. I just want to get it tight enough that it's in place and there's no extra stuff hanging out over at the ends. Then I just keep going. So I've got it under where I left off. So my next one is over, under, over, under, over, under. All the way. This time it can go to the end. Now I'm finishing with an over. So I'm going to remember that. But I'm going to pull my yarn till it's tight. Not super tight. I don't want to yank on it. I just want it tight enough that I can push it up to the top and have it ready. That's my first row of weft. Then I'm going to start again. Now my yarn ended on this side, so this is really important. If my yarn ended on the right side, I'm going to start on the right side. If my yarn ends on the left side, I start on the left side. So this time, yarn's on right, I'm going to start on right. Take my needle again, and last time I started or I ended with over, so this time I start with under. So I'm going to go under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, all the way. And I find it's helpful to say my pattern out loud. If I say it out loud, I remember what I'm supposed to do. I got to the end of my needle, so I'm going to pull, and again, I want to pull tight, but I don't want it to be too tight. If I pull too tight, see how it yanks that string over? We don't want yanked strings. We want our warp to lay flat. So I'm going to keep this over here and pull it so that that stays flat on the side. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll hold my needle there and I just poke it in and give it a good tug so I know that it's nice and tight. Then I keep going. I left off with under, so I go over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under. And I finished with an under. Again, I just put my needle there because I don't want it to get too tight. I push my weaving up, and once it's good and tight again, and I've pushed it up, I go ahead and just keep going. Now my needle's on the left, so I start on the left. I ended going under, so this time I go over, under, over, under, over, under, over, all the way across. Now, big problems that boys and girls run into when they're weaving is as they're working, they start to yank too tight and they'll start getting their piece to start to squish together. That is just something that unfortunately you'd have to undo your weaving to get it to fix. So if I hold this here, that helps me. And then I can go ahead and keep going. The other thing that I see So some of the problems that students run into as they're weaving might include that they start weaving in the wrong order. Now, one, they'll start maybe weaving and they'll not look at what the last row was, and they'll start going to make it look exactly the same. When I do this, what ends up happening, I'm only going to do a little here, but if I pull, you'll see it undoes my last few stitches. I don't want that. If it happens though, just make sure you go back, reweave it, and then try again. Again, always look. The other problem that you can run into is that you end up ending on the left, but starting on the right. You'll end up with a strip going across this way if you do it. Just undo what you did and start the row over. The very last thing that might happen is that you might need to add more string. If that happens, just take your string off your needle by just pulling on that loop there, tie a new string to it, and just go ahead and start going again. You might swap colors. You might try, again, just adding a new piece. So again, all I'm going to do to tie them together is I make my X, loop the top one, make my X, loop the top one, and then pull tight. Once it's pulled tight, I just find my end, and I'd go ahead and reattach my needle, and I'm ready to go. Again, make a long tail, make a loop around my finger, push that loop through, pull my needle through the loop, and then go ahead and just pull on the end until it's tight and ready to go. Okay? Again, when you're all done, let me know and I will help you take and finish this off. If you have a mistake that you can't figure out, let me know. Again, just remember, you don't just have to use yarn. Try fabric. Try using something from outside, like a stick or a feather that you might find, or even just a blade of grass that's really long. Ribbons work great. Plastic bags that you've cut into strips, or pieces of cardboard, or anything else you can imagine are really fun to weave into. So give some different ideas. If you're stumped, take a look at some of my books that I have, and they're great ways for you to get ideas on how to get started.